I'm quite practical.
Good morning.
Reflecting my law school background. I want to know what
Will all the stragglers please get their cup of coffee and take their seats? We've got a great presentation and program for you this morning. Today, this session is entitled Catholic Feminism and the Culture of Death. And what we have to give you today is 3 presentations by 3 women who are Catholics, feminists, and academics, each representing their own take and their own discipline in coming together to examine this common, complicated problem. Our first speaker this morning will be Helen Alvaro, who is currently an associate professor of law at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. Prior to this position, she was the Director of Planning and Information for Pro-Life Activities for the United States Catholic Conference. Our second speaker this morning will be Margaret Monahan Hogan, who's an Associate Professor at King's College in the Philosophy Department, who has written widely on areas of ethics and particularly medical ethics. Our final speaker this morning will be Professor Maura Ryan, who is an associate professor in the theology department and who specializes in moral theology and particularly not only medical ethics, but some of the new reproductive technologies that you see talked about, it seems, in every issue of the New York Times. So each of these 3 speakers will make their presentation, and then we will have a discussion among both the panel members and the wider audience. So, Professor Alvaro.
Morning. I still have to suppress a giggle every time someone says professor to me. I'll get used to that in about 6 years, I guess. It's a pleasure to see you again on this, lightly named topic, Christian feminism and the culture of death. I remember when that first became popularly used, my husband said, you know, you're going to have to go over to Rome and work in the PR department over there because they got to come up with something a little bit more appealing to talk about than the culture of death. However, there's a lot to it, a lot that it's interesting. And the question that I want to address this morning for 10 or 15 minutes is whether there should be a role specifically for women, specifically Christian women, in the struggle against a culture of death. Frankly, my answer comes from a number of years of very practical experience in this arena, and I think the answer is very clearly yes, that there's not simply a role for all Christians. There's very specifically some roles that Christian women can do particularly well. A first role that I think Christian women can play uniquely well is to restore a good name, in fact, a holy name, to the notion of service. You may recall in the 1960s and 70s that the women's movement of that time in particular got a lot of rhetorical power out of decrying the role that women were playing in the home and really in marriage and in families as mothers and as wives very generally. They made fun of the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, shopping, portrayed women as, you know, dray horses during manual labor in the care of children and families. Any care that benefited the husband was looked on with some disdain. They saw this work as unappreciated, physical, not mental, generally beneath women, and had the effect of rendering people's understanding of women as, per se, lesser than men. This critique expanded outside of women's role in marriage and family and had the effect, I think, of generally demeaning service, not only in the home, but as a way of life or service occupations in general. Service occupations that women traditionally disproportionately worked in were where women were told these are not occupations that you should focus on, ones like nursing, teaching, secretarial work, and so forth. women were encouraged to think about jobs held traditionally by men as superior jobs. I often think of Pat Ireland, who, as I've debated her a number of times on television, and she's very charming in television appearances. You know, she's the head of the National Organization of Women. And I had to try and suppress a laugh because I didn't want to agree with her when she would describe her former career as a flight attendant as one in which she, quote, accepted people's trash and said, "Thank you for it," unquote. I see this as sort of a summary of the demeaning of the service roles that women have disproportionately engaged in. So again, women were encouraged to do the work that men do, which is perceived as delegating, delegating the harder work to others. It gave the idea of service a bad name in a very general way. But of course, Christian teaching, and you see this summarized particularly in Evangelium Vitae and in the papal encyclical Mulieris Dignitatem, speaks of the very heart of the Christian vocation as being the man or woman for others, as being at the heart of conforming oneself to Christ, as being at the heart of the practice of Christian love, and that separating oneself from this understanding of who we are as deathly to us, as separating oneself from the life and nurture of Jesus Christ. Christianity also teaches that an integral part of being in God's image and likeness is being in relationship, just as God is always in relationship in the Trinity, that we too are meant to be, as humans in God's image and likeness, in relationship, in community, which necessarily implicates mutual service, interdependence, complementarity. I therefore believe that Christian women could play a special part in restoring a good name to the labor that is involved in care for others without its demeaning aspects, that Christianity has the resources for restoring the idea of community with men, not subjugation in that community, complementarity, relationship without inequality. Now, I think that's tricky today because of the dominance of the choice ethic, as in, so long as you freely choose X, X is legitimate for you, but nothing further is proved about X than that it is legitimate for you. A woman's choice today to spend herself full-time on her family or to spend herself both on career outside the home and children, either way is considered a sacred cow that is not permitted to be commented upon in, normative commentary in public. And so everything is simply your choice and it is good for you. Therefore, Christian women are going to have to, I think, articulate the larger truth about finding Christ and finding one's true self in the gift of self for others, no matter how one chooses to give that gift, but to take it beyond simply the language of my choice into my choice to serve as a good choice on itself. Second special role that I think women can play in the struggle against the culture of death, Christian women can play, is with respect to an issue that perhaps more than any other has led to the conclusion that the culture of death is among us, that is the issue of abortion. While abortion is not supported by the majority of women, in particular not by the majority of mothers, abortion still derives its greatest support demographically from non-Hispanic, white, educated males over 35. That's the single strongest cohort of support for abortion. When women are surveyed from the 60s to the present, they still demonstrate lesser support for abortion and more understanding of the humanity of the child in the womb at an earlier point. So abortion has not been spearheaded as a movement primarily by women. However, it is widely understood as a subject on which women possess special competence. When a man stands up to speak, he has not only the hurdle of overcoming presuppositions that his audience may have about abortion in favor of abortion, but he also has the hurdle of overcoming his maleness. A woman either gets an advantage for being female and speaking about it, or at least neutralizes that factor when she gets up and speaks. I think a current topic on which women ought to be speaking, and which will be very fruitful in the area of abortion, and is of particular female competence, is the question of post-abortion distress. I've spent the last year and a half before I left the Bishops' Conference working on this topic, and I had a chance to review perhaps 100 articles from medical journals around the world on this subject. And in fact, I did it was absolutely months and months in the making, because the evidence was so, researchers were looking for so many different things. But I did do a summary of the state of the evidence on this that's on the website that we have, hopeafterabortion.com. And what one sees in the best studies, the record-based studies in particular, in countries like Denmark and Finland, where every woman's medical history has been kept from birth to the present time, and so there is not a self-selection bias in the studies that have been done regarding women who experience distress after abortion. What one is seeing from these record-based studies is that women who have abortions have sometimes 3 to 6 times the rate of suicide of women who either do not have children or women who were pregnant and brought the child to term. They have twice the rate of psychiatric admissions of women who gave birth to children. Even in the U.S., which has no record-based studies yet. Brenda Major at UCLA, who is a very avid proponent of legal abortion, has written a body of work, along with some other researchers, that indicate that there are a number of risk factors for a woman's likelihood to experience post-abortion distress. The interesting thing is that those who support abortion take great consolation from the fact that these risk factors do not seem, or that not more than 50% of women report post-abortion distress in any of these studies. The problem is that the risk factors are indicating that you have still a huge percentage of women, perhaps close to 50%, who have what even the most strongly supportive, those most strongly supportive of legal abortion would say are huge risk factors for experiencing post-abortion distress. Things like having had more than one abortion. Well, I mean, almost 50% of all abortions are repeats now. It's up to 49% of all abortions are a woman's second, third, fourth, or more. Youth. Having a difficult personal situation that leads you to have the abortion. Well, there's a tremendous number of abortions that fall into that category. Abortion of a child with a disability, which is reported by about 7% of women having abortions, even though the majority of those do not say they had any disability confirmed in the child. They suspected one, or feared that they did something early in the pregnancy which might have caused one. But anyway, you add up these risk factors, and that's a lot of women at risk. And considering we still have 1.3 million abortions a year, that's a lot of women at risk. There is a very particular place for women to stand up and speak effectively about an issue that is perceived to be a woman's issue, and that does indeed, on the ground, have some of its most serious psychological consequences for women, especially those who undergo abortion. Finally, a role that I think Christian women can play is bridging the political divide that currently exists between those authentically entitled women's issues and opposition to death-dealing measures like abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide. You may have noticed just the way our political parties have evolved, that those who are the most vocal regarding women's needs for better child care services, better health care, better job opportunities, also seem to be the same politicians who are most strongly supportive of abortion, right up through and including partial birth abortion. A Christian feminist can bridge this without taking an extra breath. It is who we are as Christian feminists to be concerned about not only the sacredness of human life, but the dignity of life from beginning to end. We see some of the most serious consequences of this not only here in the United States, where women in some of the most difficult social and economic circumstances are spoken to by politicians who link abortion with a pro-woman agenda in such a way that disadvantaged populations, particularly the poor, feel that they have no choice but to accept both of these agendas together. And that women who come in with the feminist agenda have a credibility when they speak about the need for abortion. We see this also abroad. Catholics for a Free Choice is particularly active in South America. They get a lot of funding from the MacArthur Foundation and other foundations to go there, and they come in with an anti-macho, feminist, anti-spousal abuse, and so forth agenda and bring abortion with it. Their credibility is dramatically enhanced. We also see it in the context of United Nations conferences which attempt to deal with population and development and women's issues. Massive programs of government-sponsored birth control that is handed out in something approaching or often is outright a coercive manner are tied with a feminist agenda, feminist rhetoric. And it's terribly destructive. Not only is it not what is going to solve the population and development issues that are going on in that country, but women are bearing the worst burdens of being coerced to use certain forms of birth control, coerced to be sterilized, coerced to have abortions. I think that the church, the Catholic woman in particular, is in a uniquely advantageous position to address this. The Holy See's activities, particularly at the UN conferences in Beijing and Cairo, show us that there's another way. The Catholic programs on the ground, the kind that we just heard about in the debt forgiveness discussion, we have tremendous programs on the ground with a unique amount of contact with citizens, Catholic Relief Services in particular. We have an excellent idea about what women and families in these countries really require to overcome pressures that may be created by a lack of resources for the number of people that are there. Better information and more goodwill than is often had by the international diplomats who go to these UN conferences, who are often taken from the most elite top percentage of society. Marianne Glendon delivered a paper at the Holy See's conference in Rio on the family, where she did a brilliant description of the international diplomats who take ideas that would absolutely never fly in their own countries about what should be done with and to the poor, and take them to these international conferences. And then the group of elite representatives from these dramatically poor countries together agrees how the poor should be handled at these international fora, and then attempt to carry that out as an international mandate locally after the conferences are over. What the Holy See did was, not only from our teaching, but also from our vast experience on the ground in these poorest countries, propose what women and families really need, which is a combination of some of the most basic goods: education, health care, clean water, help with their maternity, not simply in avoiding it. And one finds from the best economic studies, the best studies done by the international economists, Amartya Sen has written beautifully on this, that in countries where development is really attended to, particularly through attention to women's basic needs and basic equality, the pressure between population size and available resources does diminish. That pressure diminishes. The countries actually do experience development. I think that the Christian woman is in a uniquely good position to bridge the political gap, both domestically and internationally, between those who support feminism, but at the same time propose death as a solution to some of the problems that women are experiencing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. As we got together right before this, we hoped that we were not going to overlap. We did first get together just before this. Now, if we understand culture to be a pattern of behavior transmitted by social means, and if we understand culture as a strong and powerful influence on behavior, we have much to fear in a culture that so often chooses killing human beings as the solution to human problems. So I'm picking up on the theme that Helen just ended with. Today I'd like to address just one in the long list of choices of death over life, and that issue is abortion. I'd like to talk a little bit about my puzzlement in regard to abortion, and then I'd like to talk just a little bit about the genesis of culture, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about a corrected version of feminism, all in the 15 to 20 minutes that I've been allotted. Now, don't think for a moment that I'm not acutely aware of the pain and suffering involved in the other issues, and also don't think that I've spent my life in single-minded opposition to abortion, although I have spent considerable energies there. I've spent 20 years working with men in maximum security prison in Green Bay, Wisconsin also. But abortion has been a pressing issue in my entire adult life. Sidney Callahan and I can both attest to this, that abortion has paralleled our whole academic and professional lives. We can match with Helen stories of the debates and the imbalance of the debates and the 15-to-1 odds over the years that the debates have been supposedly fairly presented in the United States. As a graduate student in New York City, the abortion juggernaut erupted fiercely onto the political scene and sped quickly, without thought, through the state legislature. And as a young woman, I took part in the debates in the early 60s and in the early 70s. And I watched the early victories of the pro-abortion coalition. And then I saw a tidal change. I saw a tidal change as to the question, choose what? Another question was addressed. It was the question, what are you choosing? What are you choosing? What is this claimed right to choose? The identification of the what as the choice of death was the catalyst for a brief reversal in the early 70s, 71, 72, that was negated by the January 1973 decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Now, from the beginning of the abortion controversy, I was struck, and I continue to be struck, by the particular horror that a woman would destroy a new life developing within her body, that spouses, boyfriends, and parents would be accomplices and sometimes instigators in such deeds, and that the learned professions of law and medicine and the academy would fashion arguments, procedures, and statutes to accomplish and facilitate what heretofore had been an unspeakable horror. For ours was a generation that learned, that studied, that read, that heard the history of other horrors of wanton destruction of human life. If abortion destroys a developing human life, and there is ample evidence that it does so, then the cumulative number of abortions in the United States is both perplexing and problematic. It is problematic because at the rate of more than 1 million a year for almost 30 years, more than 30 million, the numbers are fast outdistancing the killing wrought by the totalitarian regimes of the last century. However, to speak about numbers is to leave the discussion on an abstract and detached level. For the numbers, when we speak of abortion, represent deaths of vulnerable, dependent human beings, professionally, medically killed by the choices of the women who carry them within their bodies. Recently, my puzzlement in this regard was dissipated somewhat. I heard a lecture by Totoroff right here at Notre Dame, who developed the theme of the intellectual foundations of totalitarianism. At first I was startled, and then I was intrigued by the notion that there was such a thing as an intellectual foundation for such a horrible set of occurrences. I had always thought, rather naively perhaps, that the combination of power and will supplied the sufficient account for such horror in such a short amount of time. Now, I don't want to deny for a moment that the pursuit of power and evil had a play. If Gil Meilander were here instead of in another room, he would be reminding us of that. Nonetheless, Todoroff's lecture allowed me to see the particular power of a particular constellation of ideas that form a particular culture and the consequences of the unleashing of that power. It occurred to me as I thought about Todorov's lecture that what he was talking about was culture as a particular surround, which delineated the horizon within which people live and work and think and make choices. While the culture he described was the product of many decades of human making, it had become a powerful force in human shaping, a law to direct choices, action, and development. Now, we tend to think of culture and development of culture as progress. We tend not to think of it as decline. But if we understand culture as developing in accord with emergent probability, a theme developed by Bernard Lonergan in his seminal work, Insight, we can begin to understand the possibility of decline as well as the possibility of progress. Culture is the product of world process in which the design is emergent probability. Emergent probability results from the combination of condition schemes and their respective probabilities of emergence and survival. It is the explanatory notion that supplies the adequate account of a dynamic process within which classical laws operate, within which statistical laws operate, and within which human beings operate. As a human product, and I think this is very important to remember, that culture is a human product. The generation of culture is a function of the underlying manifold, that is, advances in technology, prosperity, and economic stability. Advances in the underlying manifold, however, are propelled by human intelligence. As detached and disinterested, this tends to favor progress. The advancement in culture then in turn favors human advancement in a mutual and reciprocal progression as each creates and is created by the other. Human beings then become executors of culture. They become the executors of emergent probability of human affairs. However, the pure desire to know is just one director of human action. There has to be an underlying manifold that is congenial to progress. There has to be a set of correct insights that supply the intellectual foundation. And there has to be an agent who is driven by the desire to know, to act upon the ideas, and take advantage of the underlying manifold. The present underlying manifold, so we are told, is the richest in the history of the world, at least here in the United States. Why, then, a culture of death? What I want to suggest is that the cause lies in a particular constellation of ideas and in the structure of the human agent. I'll take first that structure of the human agent and then pass on to that constellation of powerful ideas. I want to return again to Lonergan, and I want to talk about there the bias that is generated by common sense. He says, in addition to the eros of intelligence, there is a bias of common sense, which operates in the individual, in the group, and in general. Bias in the individual arises as human sensitive spontaneity of the dramatic subject, operating from its particular partial development, competes with and overpowers and sometimes refuses the drive of intelligence. The consequence of the tension between intelligence and sensitive spontaneity in the individual results more often than not in the operation of the bias of egoism, in which the desires of the individual, rather than the good of the individual, control intelligent planning and decision-making. Lonergan describes this bias of egoism as the failure to pivot from the initial and preliminary motivation provided by desires and fears to the self-abnegation involved in allowing complete free play to intelligent inquiry. Group bias, and there's a great deal of that operative in our culture, has its origin in a particular social group. The ethos and interest of the group tend to favor its advancement. The more powerful the group, the more probable its advancement. If the interests in the group are not compatible with the group of another group or with the good of order, tension results. The group is susceptible to the same sort of bias as the individual. That is, the failure to raise questions and the failure to allow the emergence of insights that reveal its own adequacy or error. Development rather than forward and upward progress becomes stagnated or twisted. For progress of the social order is not automatic. The general bias of common sense results from the unevenness of human development. Biological maturation occurs much sooner. and much more often than the development of intelligence and reasonableness. Lonergan maintains that the general bias of common sense combines with group bias to account for certain features of a distorted dialectic in which fruitful ideas are excluded and others suffer mutilation by compromise. The exclusion of a dominant group of ideas other than its own initiates the short cycle of decline, and the longer cycle of decline is initiated and sustained by the refusal of the drive of intelligence and the rejection of its own immanent norms. Let's shift for a minute and look now not to the subject, but to the powerful ideas that are exercising a great influence in the fashioning of our culture as a culture of death. These ideas stem from a particular form of feminism and a particular form of liberalism. In the midst of the second moment of the feminist movement of the 20th century, some feminists began to advance the claim of a right to abortion as a fundamental right, a necessary right, so that women might have absolute control of their reproductive finality and hence absolute control of their lives. The defense of the absolute right to abortion was advanced in a set of ideas. Most of us who have written and lectured and taught on this topic have identified a constellation of ideas, some of which focus on the women and some of which focus on the conceptus, the conceived but unborn human being. As a matter of fact, here is the set of claims as I received them from my upper division class of students in a Catholic school, Catholic college, most of whom had a Catholic education. Among the claims that they presented on the part of to advance the cause of abortion on the side of the woman were the right to control of her body, the necessity of autonomy and choice and the attainment of personal responsibility, the right of women to full social equality, the right of women to self-determination, and the very sounding American-sounding freedom to choose. Among the claims made in regard to the conceptus to advance the cause of abortion were it is not fully human, it is not a person, it must await the bestowal of rights upon it by the woman within whose body it resides, and further, if it is disabled, it should be killed rather than allowed to suffer. Just as my students were getting ready to wrap up, they offered one final restriction. No man has a right to enter the discussion. The bias engendered by a liberalism that views the will of the autonomous rights-bearing individual as the central truth of human progress was most powerfully and publicly proclaimed by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in the Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision, wherein she wrote regarding the liberty protected in the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment, and we heard that repeated yesterday by Helen, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of the meaning of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Sheer nonsense. It is a view, though, that has its intellectual roots in Rawls and Dworkin, and in an act of raw philosophical positivism, it is quoted by them in the philosopher's brief, presented as an amicus curiae brief to the United States Supreme Court as it considered the issue of physician-assisted suicide. Here the myth of the autonomous person operates where in another world and at another time the myth of the Volk was operative. What is the response of the Catholic feminist? What is the higher viewpoint from which it judges the view of the radical feminist and the views of the contemporary liberal to be biased? What is the remedy for the bias of common sense? The remedy lies in both the intellect and the heart. Sandra Schneider suggested in her 2000 Madaleva lecture that the feminism necessary for the establishment of peace and justice is to be found, and I quote, in the biblical sense of universal right relationships founded in shared creaturehood, and for Christians, participation in the salvation offered to Jesus, in Jesus, to all people. Note the first, right relationships and shared creaturehood, not autonomous rights-bearing individuals. Right relationships founded in shared creaturehood. The reality is that we are dependent creatures, dependent in the most absolute and radical way for our very existence and for the continuation of that existence, first upon God and then upon each other. This realization forces us to recognize that we have our being in this world as beings in relation. related to God and related to each other. An examination of human lives as that of dependent creatures embedded in relationships suggests the following. Autonomy is always a limited accomplishment achieved over time, if at all, and achieved only after a long period of dependency and often followed by another period of dependency. Living the rich human life often places human beings in asymmetrical relationships of varying degrees throughout life. Autonomy is always limited. It is constrained by the relationships that define one's life. Relationships to others oftentimes requires the acceptance of disadvantage for the sake of others. The understanding of our lives as woven in relationships gives substance to our obligations. We exist in real relationships to one another, and from these relationships, specific duties, concrete duties, arise and are defined. These relationships limit and structure the activity of willing. It is our existence as related beings which is the source of community, of hospitality, of mutual respect, and of liberty as ordered. It is our being in relationship that defines the obligations of the powerful to the powerless. Now, what does participation in the salvation offered in Jesus to all people mean? There are many indicators of its meaning. In the life of Jesus, in the parables of Jesus, in the friends of Jesus, women and men who accompanied him on his journey, and in the attitudes of Jesus. But there's also the explicit command found in the Gospel of Mark. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we repeat this passage blithely often enough, but we do not pause long enough to reflect on it and attempt to grasp its meaning. This New Testament passage commands the activities of the mind, the activities of the intellect, as well as those of the heart and soul and strength. How are we to understand loving God with our intellect? To turn our intellect to God would seem to have several notes. The first is to tend toward God as object, and in that limited grasp, order our love. Our love is to be ordered first toward God. The second is to open our intellect to be receptive to the Spirit of God, and in the reception of that Spirit, to bear it to a world which is much in need of the nourishment of that healing Spirit. The third is to use the intellect as God's good gift, to pursue the truth, to raise every question, to apprehend and overcome the biases presented by the individual desires or pressed by ideas resident in powerful and popular groups. The bias of common sense is overcome by education and moral maturation, which requires time. The bias of powerful it does now talk to be an act of claim what right and against claims of autonomy and unspecified conditions. It affirms that moral maturity requires the admission of radical dependency, autonomy, the duty toward others, and the right of others. The culture of death and the emergence of life requires human beings a faithful, careful, patient building, brick by brick, truth, witness by witness, of communities striving to love each other as God loves us.
Thank you, Peg. I want to pick up on something that both Craig and Helen stressed, and that's the contribution of Catholic feminism as a voice for the dispossessed in a society in which we often deal with our problems by doing away with our problems. But I also want to raise some questions about Catholic feminism today and where we are. When we hear Catholic feminism, it's natural to think immediately about debates over reproductive issues, gender and sex roles in the family and in society, and also women's place in the church. That Catholic feminism conjures up for most people either in-house struggles over women's ordination or what are often called the pelvic issues is understandable, but I believe that it's unfortunate. It's understandable in that there are serious and continuing questions to be raised over women's leadership and ministry in the church. There continues to be a pressing need to figure out how to best secure social and economic and political equality for women, particularly in developing nations. And the problems of freedom and responsibility in reproduction are by necessity experienced uniquely and disproportionately by women. These need to be issues for Catholic feminists. But the tendency to narrow women's issues to reproduction and ordination is unfortunate for a couple of reasons. First, as a practical matter, the moral concerns of women extend far beyond these categories. As Lisa Cahill pointed out in a recent article, Catholic Ethics, Women and the Real World, ethical issues that concern Catholic women today include family and career, business ethics and economic justice in the areas of corporate restructuring, ethnic and race relations, immigration, welfare reform, violence in our homes and cities and war abroad, capital punishment, the environment, and the increasingly technological and profit-driven biomedical establishment that is depriving more and more people of access to health care. Insofar as we miss the real-world problems facing women, insofar as we are not making the links that you were talking about politically, Catholic feminism risks becoming marginal or, at worst, trivial. And one thing that Cahill pointed out that seems right is that one of the things young women, our students, want from us as Catholic feminists is some guidance about how to construct appropriate, committed relationships in a culture that gives them no guidance, in a culture that is individualist, that is consumerist, that sells sex and sells sex without love as a constant product and a constant value, and a culture that is still sexist. But there has been little wisdom, I think, coming forward often from Catholic feminism on those questions. The narrowing of women's issues is unfortunate for another reason. The over-identification of Catholic feminism with these questions obscures the distinctive contributions Catholic theologians have made to feminism. There has always been a tension in feminism between the importance of fostering individual autonomy and expanding civil rights of women on the one hand, and a concern for fostering and protecting relational and communal commitments between the value of autonomy and the value of relationality or sociality. Catholic feminists, and I have in mind Margaret Farley, Barbara Anselson, Sidney Callahan, the feminists sitting at this table, have brought to their analysis the wisdom of the Catholic social tradition, in which the quest for justice for individuals is situated within attention to the common good, and in which the needs of the poor or the marginalized take precedence over the wants and liberties of the well-off. Catholic feminists have brought to their analysis an option for the poor, which is everywhere, all over the world, an option for women and their children. So where North American feminism, or what we often call academic feminism, has tended to equate justice with freedom and freedom with choice, those drawing from the Catholic tradition see justice as a question of the shared conditions of possibility for good human living, for participating in social life with full human dignity. As Pachamateras describes the common good, it is a concern for the sum total of conditions that allow individuals and groups ready access to their own fulfillment. Working for justice for women and men is not then just a matter of expanding areas of choice, but of making possible shared conditions for human flourishing. The difference bringing such a concern for justice makes is illustrated by looking at the question of legalizing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. In an article in the journal, and here I just want to use this as a kind of case study for looking at this difference. In an article in the journal Women in Health, Barbara Logue, who is an epidemiologist, pointed out that death in advanced industrial societies is largely concentrated at the older ages, making termination of treatment, assisted suicide, and euthanasia most salient for the elderly. Women dramatically outnumber men among the elderly, suffer more chronic illness and disability, and are the primary recipients of long-term care and the primary providers of at-home chronic care. All of these factors, coupled with women's traditional role as family caretaker and greater vulnerability to poverty, particularly at the end of their lives, serve to make end-of-life decisions, either to forego or terminate treatment, as well as to seek assistance in suicide or euthanasia, particularly salient for women. Yet, she observes, both feminist groups and mass-based aging organizations have largely ignored these concerns. Now, there may be many reasons for that in terms of political strategy, but it is true that the question of the right to die has not occupied anywhere near the status of reproductive rights in feminist political platforms. And it is not that there has been a conscious decision to separate the question of the right to die from the question of a right to abortion from reproductive rights. It's that there's silence. There's silence on the question. And it is particularly interesting because abortion and euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, are so often linked, both by those who oppose legalizing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia and those who are in favor of it. They're both seen, euthanasia is often described as the ultimate civil liberty, which is language that feminists have used over time to talk about reproductive rights. But what we see is almost a stymied silence on the question of euthanasia. What is worse, it seems to me, is that we still very seldom see the subject of end-of-life decision-making included under the umbrella of women's health issues. It has been theologians like Kathleen Caveney, Lisa Cahill, and others who have raised the question most acutely of the implications of legalizing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia for women. It has been theologians who have argued that the movement to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia has to be examined within the broader conditions under which people get sick and die in this country, and particularly the broader conditions under which women get sick and die in this country. We have to look at the conditions of possibility for living or dying or growing old with human dignity. In assessing the consequences of legalizing physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, therefore, we have to take into account the social and economic conditions that will define options. For example, the reality of unequal access to care, which persists in this country, And given the role of women in securing care for their families is a problem that affects women disproportionately. We need to take into account, for example, the reality of women's poverty, particularly what we might call widow's poverty. That is the vulnerability of women who have been dependent upon a spouse's income or a spouse's continuing pension. We need to take into account the disproportionate burden of caring for the ill on women and the very real fear many have of a prolonged dependence on their children or of being abandoned. I cared for my mother when she was dying of lung cancer, and I remember how very, very difficult it was for her to allow her child to take the role of caretaker. And nothing had prepared her for, she was quite young when she got ill, but nothing in her spiritual or social history had prepared her to allow herself to be cared for in this way, and it made it extremely difficult for her. We need to take into account the medicalization of death in this country and the reality that women have a history of experiencing their agency as submerged within the medical context. And of course, a point that Kathleen Kaveny has made well in the public forum, the role of managed care in structuring the experience of health and illness and the dominance of a market mentality in the allocation of services. When we view the question of legalizing assisted suicide or euthanasia from the perspective of the common good, I mean, when we ask as a prior question, to what extent do social conditions exist for living with dying in a dignified way? To what extent are there resources available for dealing with aging or with chronic or terminal illness in a way that constitutes an acceptance with dignity and grace? And not just, and here I mean not just the social and the medical conditions, although they're enormously important, but also the religious resources and spiritual resources. When we take into account all of these factors, we see that women may well be an especially vulnerable population were physician-assisted suicide to be legalized. We know, for example, that a disproportionate number of Kevorkian's victims were women. We also know from the data that we have from the Netherlands that there is a gender differential in requests and how requests for euthanasia are handled in the willingness of providers to grant requests or not grant requests. We also know that if we study the history of requests to terminate treatment, that it has been more difficult for women to have their requests to terminate treatment honored. So it's a two-edged question. It may be easier to be killed, harder to die in the sense of accepting one's death at a point that one believes that that's appropriate. The point is that the way in which euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide symbolizes or sustains a culture of death may well be worked out with particular urgency in the lives of elderly women who, viewed in terms of an efficiency-oriented, profit-driven, youth-celebrating, independence-valuing culture, may be one of the most expendable populations of all. The contribution of the Catholic moral tradition to feminist thinking on this question is the ever-present attention to the common good. Justice is never just a question of expanding or preserving spheres of liberty for individuals, a point that Peg made wonderfully. It is the case that enhancing autonomy is part of respecting dignity. But what is at issue is creating social conditions for human flourishing, of which autonomy is a part, but it is autonomy for relationship in a feminist vision. And it is attending to those conditions that marginalize groups of individuals or make impossible that flourishing. That is to say, we always have to take into account the consequences of our choices. We are responsible not just for what we do or what we choose, but with what our freedom creates. And this is so even in choices that we make about how we are to die. To draw from Judge Noonan's talk of the first evening, the questions of justice, it seems to me, for Catholic feminism always include an eye to these questions of structural cooperation. Brazilian feminist theologian Ivone Gabarra captures, I think, the contribution of Catholic feminism. The persistence of women in the struggle for life and the restoration of justice have been linked together and lived out as expressions of faith, as the presence of God in the struggles of history. Work for justice is an expression of our desire to struggle for a more human world in which certain values presently dormant may be aroused, where people can accept affection, where life may triumph over the powers of death. Thanks.
Great presentations, one and all. Before I open it to the audience, I want to see if the panel members have any questions to ask each other. You're tired. Okay, audience, it's your turn.
Hi, Mike Brumman, University of St. Thomas. Professor Alvaro, you mentioned both yesterday and today the issue of contraception, at least alongside of abortion. And I was wondering if our panelists would like to tackle the issue of the connection, if there be any, between the promulgation, the acceptance of contraception with public opinion and the legalization of abortion, specifically if there's any cause-effect relationship, at least in attitudes in the culture of death.
Yes, I'll start there. I have not seen a good study on causation. What I have seen is solid empirical data that shows that increased government funding of contraception in public programs has, at least for its first 20 years, coincided with an increase in the use of abortion. Instead of driving abortion numbers down, they went up together. Planned Parenthood had a conference and published a book as a result called Abortion in Europe in the 1990s, in which various demographers and economists and sociologists agreed that abortion rates would always go up when contraception was first introduced in a large scale in a population. They didn't go into detail, but one can make an educated guess that when you introduce the idea of separating sex from the possibility for permanent commitment, that contraception will never be enough because it fails so regularly. And also because good studies show, those I'm thinking of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where I think they still have the highest teen pregnancy rate in the nation, that the young women are not getting pregnant because they don't know about contraception, but because they're operating in an environment where the young men have separated sex from commitment, but the young women have not. And they're getting pregnant for reasons, not because they don't know about contraception for a moment, but because they want commitment, they want, that's their understanding of their future, they want to test with commitment, they want to test their sexuality. That said, when the church steps in these international debates, particularly at the UN, where the best that the U.S. could do in terms of helping women was not to put a price tag on how much it would cost to educate women who are not receiving that in third world countries, but they could seem to figure out to the penny how much it would cost to hand them all contraception. And believe you me, I mean, they're also smuggling in what they call menstrual extraction kits, but are actually early abortion kits, and are using international funding not to provide abortion, but to build abortion clinics. They knowingly are raising abortion rates in these countries. If the rates go down in the long run, the best you can, which in the U.S. they began to do in 1990, abortion rates began to go down. The best you can say is that these programs that separated the idea of sex from commitment have introduced into the culture probably both a permanent reliance on contraception and abortion until somebody breaks it.
Okay, Joe?
Yes, Joseph Capizzi.
Oh, I'm sorry. We've got other commentators.
I just wanted to respond to that question, and I guess I would, not as political questions, as moral questions, I would want to separate contraception and abortion. I mean, they seem to me to be different questions with different levels of complexity and so on. But I would think that where there is an important connection, it's between, it's in the tendency in both cases, in people's relation to contraception and abortion, to think of all, this is something that's been raised earlier today, to think of all choices as contingent. And you might also include certain kinds of genetic testings and so on under this umbrella. That is to say, if we think of all relationships as simply a matter of choice, all obligations and responsibilities open for negotiation. So we don't think of ourselves as kind of being given or born into certain sorts of relationships. Then both contraception and abortion always allow you to renegotiate your obligations and commitments. And it would seem to me that that's where there's an important mental connection.
Peg, do you have anything?
Well, I do, but it would take us far afield. I think there's a very important contribution of women to make to the articulation, the continuous articulation and the development of what is the nature of marriage. And I think that's important. That's a really important contribution that we need to make. We also need to be careful about our language. I think the language of contraception immediately inclines us to a bias. It's against conception, it's against nature, so we automatically make the transition into that it's evil. And I think thirdly, and I don't want to continue that line either, but I think thirdly I want to say that it's very important to keep very clear the distinction between contraception and abortion. And remember that abortion takes the life of a living, developing human being. And if we keep allowing the contraceptive issue to enter into the debate, we lose ground practically. And so I think it's always very important to separate those issues and not to be allowed them to be necessarily tied together.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I have a question I think that applies to all the panelists, although perhaps to Professor Ryan a little bit less than the other two. Professor Alvaro did a nice job of describing sort of like the genesis of feminism and the association of that word with particular commitments. And I'm wondering why retain the word feminism at all? And the reason this arises is because I noticed that Professor Ryan was more eager to say, to discuss feminism and feminists than I think the first two panelists were. And it seems to me, though, when you all move to substantive claims, what feminism is and how it can, or Catholic feminism is, and how it can contribute to, undermining the culture of death, it seemed like you were describing Catholic social teaching, as I think even Professor Ryan acknowledged. So what is it that's gained by continuing to use this term, which I'm sure you're all aware also has as a possible risk, alienating people because of its association with prior commitments that perhaps none of you would like to be associated with?
Okay, I would just like to start with the fact that if you take a look at this idea of the autonomous, rational, choosing, will-directed individual, I think that topic, that notion as that fiction, seems to come out of a Western male Enlightenment tradition. And I think the claim that women have to offer, the enrichment, the perspective that women have to offer, is this perspective of our being in relationship. I think we're much more acutely aware of this than are men. And I think that's a sexual difference, and I think that's important. And I think it's a contribution that women have to make. So to that degree, I think there's an advantage to keeping the term feminism, although we quickly distance ourselves from the set of values that are enunciated by that second movement of 20th century feminism after the 60s when they grab onto abortion. Certainly early feminism did not gravitate to abortion.
Two things. I think for two reasons I still cling on to it. Number one is, like Margaret, to mark out something that Catholic women do as women and as Catholics. And, when you look at Mulieris Dignitatem, the Holy Father talks about women being first in the order of love. And frankly, that I shy away from that actual language a little bit because I don't like the language of first and second in this. But I certainly do think that women have an openness to relationship, that our ability to bear children is both substance and sign of, I always use the anecdote when I think about women's relational living. And this is just absolutely typical. I've been married for 15 years, and my husband will meet up with an old friend, and I'll say, "What'd you talk about?" "Nothing." I'll say, "Well, he just got divorced. I mean, didn't you talk about that?" "No." I mean, I don't even have to go on about what a woman would do in that conversation. I mean, when my best friend got divorced, I told her my husband had to go away with all the children for the weekend, which was a total lie, and insisted she come up, and we talked about the divorce nonstop for 3 days. I mean, there is a specifically, I do think, feminine relational trajectory, number one. Number two, I have to tell you, I use it in part purely pragmatic reasons. In order to make the distinction between, if available to people, between what the women's movement of the 60s and 70s was presuming and offering and what we presume and offer, you have to get to the table to be allowed to make the distinction. And I use it to get to the table.
I think it's a great question, Joan. There have been lots of efforts even within feminism to distance various groups from the African Americans. Feminists call themselves womanists, for example, and Latin American use various words, mujerista, and so on. I think it's an important term to continue to hang on to, even though we have to fight about what it means all the time. My students always come in the classroom, and the women in particular, and the first thing they say is, "I'm not a feminist." So then I say, "Well, do you believe in this? Do you believe, for example, in the equal dignity of men and women?" "Oh, yes." Do you think it's a good thing that Notre Dame admitted women and that you have the opportunity to attend this university regardless of gender? "Oh, yes." Now when you interview, do you want to be counted on your merits as an accountant or an engineer and so on, and not on the question of gender? "Oh, yes." You see, so I think there is something, there is a territory that we want to retain, and I think the other danger is this. Many of my students think that feminism should die because the questions are settled. They're settled. I'm here. I'm at Notre Dame. We're through the glass ceiling. The issues are settled. Even if we think they might be, in some sense, settled in this country, they're far from settled. One of the things giving up the word risks is forgetting our history, and I think that would be very, very unfortunate.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Joe Switek. I have a background in physics, actually, so I feel a little bit out of place, but nevertheless, I take a strong interest in these issues and some of the things that are happening in our country. I guess my question is directed to those of you who have been on the front lines of the abortion debate, especially in television and the media. When we see people like you said, Helen, like Pat Ireland, for example, on television, or even Kate Michelman, they often talk about this issue in terms of in terms of feminism is in terms of a compassion for women. Even though, like you said, Helen, the effects of abortion on women are so profound in a negative way. And I guess my question is, away from the television cameras, when you hear them speak, is it just an honest difference of opinion? Do they really care about women and want to do what's best for them? Or are they driven by perhaps a different agenda?
I can only speak from personal experience, and I'd actually be anxious to hear what Margaret has to say, because she's done this longer and has encountered more of the leaders in the movement probably than I have. What I found very flat out is that most of them had had a personal experience with abortion, and they couldn't get beyond that. They couldn't theorize about it being good or evil. I remember sitting on a panel testifying before Congress, 4 women from pro-abortion organizations, 2 of us from pro-life, and every woman, 4 out of 4, had had an abortion. Kate Michelman is very public about that, and when I meet Kate personally, and I've spent a fair amount of time with her in various green rooms, and from what I know about post-abortion, she is a classic situation. I remember Anna Quinlan, who you may recall wrote for the New York Times, and she said something nice about me in a column, and I wrote her, and I thought it was a great opportunity to chat with her because I thought I saw convert potential. So we met, and I said, please, I won't let this go any further, but can you tell me? And she said, oh, no, I've written about it, No big deal. Here's where my opinion comes from. I took a friend to get an abortion when I was a freshman at a Catholic school in Philadelphia, and I was so convinced it was good for her, I really never changed my mind. It seemed to be not very well thought out and just very emotional.
I would just like to comment on this. I wouldn't want you to get the sense that everybody who is in favor of abortion is a fractured woman. I don't think that's the case, but I do think the case, there is a failure of the drive of the intellect, and there is a bias in terms of refusing to continue to raise questions. Much of the abortionist movement, as we encountered it in the 60s and 70s, and I'm sure that Sydney will back me up on this, and even in the cases that came before the United States Supreme Court, were based on lies. They were not based on truth, and we continue that pattern in the defense of the right of abortion. We continue the perpetuation of lies. And that's why I really wanted to focus on the necessity of us to continue education, to raise the question, to keep pointing out the lies. Because you can build a culture based on lies. You can build a culture based on bias, and it has a terribly destructive effect.
Would you like to add anything? Okay. Next question on the other side here.
I'm Bill Murphy. I'm here at Notre Dame. I really appreciated Professor Hogan's insights regarding anthropology, and it seemed like, basically you were talking about how it seems that there's been a lot of progress within feminism in having a more adequate understanding of what the human person is, not an autonomous individual, but a person in relation to God, relation to others. That seems to be important. But I have a related question. I'm just curious as to whether within feminism the anthropology thought is progressing regarding the relation of the body to the person. It seems to me that there's a modern understanding of the person where the person is basically the self and the body is basically an instrument. And it seems that the alternative is a more adequate anthropology where the body is a revelation of the person, a symbol or an icon of the person. And it seems that if we went down that route, we would be able to see the person as body of male and female, as indicating the complementarity intended in human relationships. And it seems that this kind of an approach would apply to a number of practical issues. So I'm wondering is there work being done in that area amongst feminist authors?
There is work being done. No, it is not being done by feminist scholars, but it is being done. I don't want to put it under the rubric of feminism. I'd like to cite just one text in which I've encountered it in addition to my own writing, is Thomas DeConnick. Am I saying that right? Is Ralph McInerney here? Is that right, David? Okay. He wrote this article called Persons and Things in Recovering Nature, a text that was done in honor of Ralph McInerney. And he writes about our being embodied. And so in the Western culture that I think comes from liberalism and the Enlightenment tradition, we seem to be this little computer disk that's inside, and, you know, we're all hard drive. And I don't think that's the case. In reality, we are in relation. I mean, the body is the first indication that we're in relation. And so for all of us, we ought to experience this. And it's not a matter of getting out of that. And so that should be our first indication of limits, is our embodied existence. And then women, of course, have other experiences which make them experience embodiment much more intimately than do men. So I think it's important to develop that. It's important to develop that and to begin a literature that develops that and says, where do you guys get this myth of, you know, this autonomous rational? That's a kind of an elitism that couldn't possibly be real. You know, look around. Let's start with your body and go on from there.
Yeah, it seems important because the alternative is to move towards androgyny, and it seems that that is that this question it would be at the forefront of of a movement forward regarding feminist thought. But thank you.
And wouldn't that be a shame to move to androgyny? We so enjoy one another in difference.
And there's, thank you.